We now take you to the broadcast of It's Time with Rev Nathaniel W Martin. Here's Reverend Martin.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, but never good night and never goodbye. I'm Rev Nathaniel Martin, pastor of New Life Institutional Baptist Church here in Los Angeles, California. And we're currently located at 8916 South Main Street. I invite you to come and worship with us. But our purpose here is to talk about It's Time. It's time primarily for us to get recompense, to get paid, to receive reparations for the harm and the dangers and the injustices of which our people have been the historic recipients here in America for all the days that we've been here, really, and especially looking back over the last from 1900 on up through 1968, if not even up until now. You notice I did not mention those 246 years of unrequited toil mentioned by President Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, because I don't consider that a lost cause. I consider that one that is under such controversy that we're going to have to fight that fight until another generation becomes the beneficiary or the recipient of that overdue largesse and repayment from this grateful nation. Let us look at our marching orders. Deuteronomy chapter 24, beginning at verse number 14, we find these words recorded by the circuit writer. Thou shalt not oppress an hired servant that is poor and needy, whether he be of thy brethren or of thy strangers that are in thy land within thy gates. What could be more straightforward than that? Thou shalt not oppress an hired servant. If you hired me or if I hired you, I must treat you fairly and justly. And that is the primary basis of our ability to have a relationship: fairness, justice, respect, and dignity. Isn't that right? Let me continue. Verse 15, at his day thou shalt give him his hire. What else could be more straight? At his day. I mean, if he work for you on Monday, you pay him Monday evening. Thou shalt give him his hire, neither shall the sun go down. That means don't keep my money in your pocket and go home with it. I don't keep your money in my pocket and go put it in my bank account. At his day thou shalt give him his hire, neither shall the sun go down upon it, for he is poor and setteth his heart upon it, lest he cry against thee unto the Lord, and it be sin unto thee. Notice, if you please, my brothers and my sisters, how straightforward God is about the interaction between the laborer and the person during the hiring, the employer and the employee, the field owner and the person who's working in the field. And don't think that doesn't apply all across the board, whether you're in the corporate boardrooms in the suites of New York or the stock market, or whether you're a sharecropper out in the back fields, back hills of Mississippi. And that holds true whether now or even back in slavery. Yes, I have to mention it because it is still America's great sin. Somebody said racism is America's great sin. Well, slavery is a consequence of that great sin of racism. And we are still dealing with that down to this very present moment. That is why we have entitled this program, this commentary, whatever you call it, It's Time. Also, while we're talking on what the Bible says about it, let us also look in the New Testament. You know, you got a group that says, well, the Old Testament don't apply no more because that was under Moses. Well, now let's go to the New Testament. Let's go to the book of James, James chapter 5. Let's look primarily at verse number 4, although the entire fourth chapter is very, very much instructive to all of us. What it says in James chapter 5 and verse 4 is that, behold, the hire of the laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, crieth, and the cries of them which have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. That means you have committed an injustice against God and against God's people. God frowns upon injustice. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. As we spout those cliches, we know them left and right. It was Lyndon Baines Johnson, one of the presidents of the United States of America, who said, you cannot take a person who has been hobbled for 250 years, bring him up to the starting line of a race, take the shackles off, and tell him, say, now you're equal, tell him or her, you're equal to everybody else, and step back and thinking that you have done a good job. You have done what you ought to have been doing. No, because there is a matter of equity. Isn't that right? That has not been honored, because the person who's been shackled is not on the same level as the people who have never been shackled or who have been free to prepare for the race all of their lives. So even in that, from speech that Johnson gave at Howard University, you can see that we owe a debt to our brothers. The old question, am I my brother's keeper? Yes, you are your brother's keeper. You are also your sister's keeper. And in generically considered, we are all brothers and sisters. And since we've come to realize, the science has finally acknowledged, although it did not acknowledge in the earlier iterations of itself, even scientists had to acknowledge that there is no black gene. There is no white gene. There is no such thing. If you look into the gene pool, looking in the DNA to find the white gene, you're wasting your time. You're looking at to find the black gene, you're wasting your time. Scripture, it bears out the scripture that says, out of one blood, God made all men for to dwell upon the face of all of this earth. And we find that the further you are from the equator, then that it affects the shade of your skin pigment. Stands to reason, if you stand right at the equator, you got to be darker than if you 3,000 miles away from the equator. However, but there are those of us in the civilization who built an idea of race, and that idea was simply in order to economically and socially exploit and subject others who were not of that same hue to the despotism that has resulted. And the confusion that has resulted in our world is still extant and present with us to this very second. We're all squinched up and tightened up. We don't want to talk about the elephant in the room and the effect that this historic outcome of racism has had, not only in the United States of America, but really all over the face of the globe. Go where you will find the effects of that doctrine, that illicit doctrine of racism that has been spewed and spouted, and for a long time was supported by so-called, put in quotes, pseudo-scientists who led us down the primrose path of racial hatred and racial differences. And now in the 21st century, we begin to recognize what has been obvious all along. Isn't that right? And so all of these matters tie into the fact that where there has been injustice, that injustice must be rectified. Where there has been inequity, that inequity has got to be accounted for. Where our brothers and sisters have been hurt, injured, harmed, wounded, knocked down, distressed, held back, hindered, harmed by the effects or the indirect effects of racial policies or policies based upon race. They have to be made whole. Just like in the insurance business, we can't wipe the tears from your eyes, but we say we'll give you this check for $1 million and you can do with it as you will. If we have harmed or been harmed, then we have a right to expect from the same government that harmed us and from the same people that harmed us that we should likewise receive healing, help, and being made whole from those same parties. And I trust that we will address ourselves as a nation and as a people. Yes, it is the social gospel, but it is a very necessary social gospel. It is social justice, and I'm a social activist. Aren't you a social activist? Don't you love justice? Don't you love righteousness? Don't you love that which is truth as opposed to that which is a lie and not truth and unjust and unrighteous? How can you trust me if I'm going to do unrighteously or unjustly or act with inequality toward you? In order for us to get along, we got to have righteousness. That is why the scripture said, let justice roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. This week was a beautiful week for me. It was the week in which we commemorated the 50-year anniversary of the assassination of the late Dr. Martin Luther King. I was honored to be invited to attend the Inner City Youth Orchestra of L.A. Gala tribute to Dr. King this week, and let me tell you, it was fabulous. I want to thank Miss Gloria Martin, no relation, for making me aware of it and insisting that I attend. I'm telling you, I was overwhelmed by the presentation. It was though I was sitting in the presence of the Holy of Holies, and to listen to the speeches and the presentation that was so sonically perfect and so endearing to me. It is something it sent chills down my spine. I sat in my seat at rapt attention. And I want to encourage you to reflect on the life and the meaning of the message of the man, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., not as a dreamer, but as its concrete effect in our daily lives, past, present, and future. Remember, Dr. King believed in attention, bringing a creative tension to injustice so that the spotlight never got off of it, so that the heat never got off of this injustice, bringing that to a point where there was a boil or opening up, where there was just something would have to be done to rectify that injustice. We don't do that anymore. We're too adept at going to dinner with the politicians. We don't eat fried chicken, but we sure eat a lot of prime rib and caviar. And you know who I'm talking about. And we say we get out of the streets and we go up into the suites. And I think we've eaten too much sweets up yonder in them suites. And we no longer have that fire in the belly that Dr. King talked about. That fire in the belly that at one point made him embrace Lyndon Baines Johnson in order to get him to sign the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Bill, which was the year before, and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the year after, and then calls him with all of the accolades and all of the encomiums being directed his way from the Johnson administration, yet he broke with Johnson on the Vietnam War issue and said, I cannot in good conscience celebrate or support this greatest purveyor, speak against violence and then support the greatest purveyor of violence in the history of the world, history of our nation, which is our own country. And so he broke with Johnson. He brought the tension. He brought the heat. He brought the fire as he spoke out in that address at the Riverside Church in April 4th, 1967, 1 year to the day in which he was assassinated, he came out against the Vietnam War. He came out against the policies of his friend Lyndon Baines Johnson. Even his own followers in the civil rights movement admonished him not to do that. Not to do that. We don't have a dog in the fight, they claim, in the fight in Vietnam. Why don't you stick to civil rights? But King said, how can we talk about civil rights here in this country and voting rights here in this country and nonviolence in this country when we're being violent and uncivil in the nation of Vietnam? When we got black boys and white boys from North and South Carolina locked in brutal solidarity to kill yellow boys over in Vietnam, trying to guarantee democracy in Southeast Asia that they cannot experience in Southeast or Northeast Georgia. And so that type of tension we don't exert any longer. We are too enamored of the political solution, and I feel that we have fallen into the amorous embrace of the political machine. I could use more stringent language, but this is a 30-minute family broadcast. You cannot sit down at Pharaoh's table and eat Pharaoh's food, my brothers and sisters, and then get up and tell Pharaoh that he's wrong. Your tendency is just not going to be that way. Dr. King never sat in such a warm embrace of the political system or the political figures, even when they were doing him some good, that he could not tell them that they were wrong, where they were wrong at. And I think that is one of the great tragedies that demonstrates the weakness of the so-called civil rights social action community now, is that we don't have the fire in the belly to tell the chief of police or the governor of the state of California or the mayor of the city of Los Angeles or a Jackie Lacey or a Mr. Garcetti or a Mark Ridley Thomas that you failed us. And these are the things that we should not have lost. And so if there's anything we can gather from the teaching of late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is to speak truth to power. Remember, just because I look like you does not mean that I like you. You got to know what my policy is. What am I standing for? What is going to be my practices? And how would what are their effects, positive and otherwise, upon your life? Because that is what the political process is for. It's to do for the people what the people cannot do for themselves as a government. But we live in a nation where they tell you on the one hand, the government is not part of the solution, government is the problem. But yet they didn't speak that type of language all through the early years of this country. They only began to speak that language when it looked as though the black people who had come out, who were still coming out from under the vestiges of slavery and Jim Crow and segregation and all of that milieu, began to finally catch a foothold economically. Remember, there's a great larceny at work in this country. It's called class. I don't want to see your class pull up to my class. And I don't want to pay for your class. That's the larceny that occurs in our nation, in our culture. It's not often spoken. It's not often voiced, but it is always present. It was present in the civil rights struggle. There was a difference between the poverty of a Fannie Lou Hamer and the poor people of Appalachia and the group that marched with Martin Luther King. Remember that the leaders Andrew Young and many of the fellows did not want to go support the garbage workers in Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. King said, well, now, if we talking about helping the poor, if the garbage workers in Tennessee ain't poor, then who is? And so, but there was a class distinction that they wanted to recognize. They didn't want them sitting at that table. Most of us don't know the names of the two poor men that got killed in Memphis that led up to the march. Poor Mr. Echo Cole and Mr. Robert Walker are overlooked and forgotten in history, but yet they were the catalysts that caused Reverend James Lawson to ask Martin King to come to Memphis to help lead that march. What will we do for the least of us? You know, those of us who got a little money, got a little house. You know, what are we going to do? We don't want to do anything for those that are homeless. Not really. We don't want to see them have a guaranteed income. But Dr. King said you need a guaranteed income. That means the government that we support, that we pay our taxes to, should guarantee that there be a level of income below which nobody would be suffered to be subjected to. But in our culture, we'll put you out your house so you didn't pay the mortgage, and we'll laugh at you on the street, and we won't help you get nowhere else to go. In our culture, you can serve your time in prison, have a fellow come out with a felony conviction, and we'll tell you can't get no food stamps, you can't get no public housing, and you ain't going to get no job. Now, what are you doing? You're guaranteeing that those people are going to have to go back into prison because you cut off what they need to survive. And you may not see it that way, but that's the way it is. We cannot continue the way that we are going and call ourselves a civilized nation. A civilized nation means that we continue to evolve into better and better behavior, better and better ethics, better and better conduct. We should not still be fighting the old racist strictures that we fought back in the 60s. But yet you have a reactionary in the White House, and you have reactionaries in Congress, in both houses, who are telling us about making America great again, going back to the good old days. I ask you the question, what good old days? I ain't seen no good old days that I want to go back to. There's been no halcyon days that I would like to go back to. No, we've got to make it where we are. You cannot stop progress. And just because you want to hold on to the vestiges and the symbols of a lost cause, of a treasonous culture that fought and plunged the nation into a fight over secession, at the root of which was that you wanted to hold people in bondage, that you did not believe in freedom for everyone or justice for everyone, and you still don't want to hold people, allow justice to roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream from anybody other than yourself, then that creates the great Waterloo. Is that right? We reached that great point where we must, my friends, come to terms, come to grips with our dislikes, our hatreds, and recognize that our hatreds and our dislikes cannot be allowed to continue to go on because they're not going to benefit the culture going forward. All over the world, we see the consequences, the historic outcomes of the effect that racialism and the doctrines that racism has spawned are having, and the ill effects that they are having all over the world. The very unrest upon the continent of Africa, a result of racism that was brought there by the European. The fact that right here in America, we don't even recognize the rest of America. We talk about white America. Well, what about Central America? What about Mexico? What about Guadalajara, Guatemala, and all of those various places? Are they not in this same North American hemisphere? How is that we only talk about white Americans in the United States of America? We got to expand our vision. We got to recommend that all men are brothers, and that includes the women. And we must begin to direct ourselves accordingly. I said all of this because, like I said, this is the 50th anniversary of the commemoration of the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it is time for us to reassess the way that we have been headed, the way that we are going. And remember, that march that in Memphis that Dr. King was leading was to get improvement in the wages, improvement in the pay scale, improvement in the working conditions there in Memphis, and that has spread all over the country. It was criminal. It was sheer slavery the way that they were treating the sanitation workers in Memphis. You had the blacks on the back doing the back-breaking work of picking up the trash cans, throwing them up there into the truck, and the white driver, who was many times very abusive, verbally abusive to the workers. He's sitting in the driver's seat in the comfortable cab out of the rain, and these poor fellas, Echo Cole and Robert Walker, had no shelter from the rain, and according to the story got out, in seeking shelter in the back of the truck, and somehow the guy that was running the truck hit the switch and crushed them. And you can think about that as you will. But we must continue to struggle and labor on, because we all need to get paid. Because you cannot have inequity in pay and expect to have peace all over this country, all over this world, as never before. People are recognizing their own sense of self-worth. They're recognizing the value of every human being. And they're also recognizing that there are those that are in positions of authority and that are in better economic positions who do not necessarily wish to see those who are less fortunate have any level of economic improvement in their lives that would cause them to live better. And that is a battle that they are not going to win, because there are more poor than there are rich. There are more people doing bad than there are people doing good. And instead of us embracing each other, we spend too much time throwing up roadblocks and stumbling blocks in each other's way. Again, as we commemorate 50 years since Dr. King's assassination, where are we? What are we doing? Are we so caught up in the luxury of our cell phones and our iPads and all of these modern technologies and the Facebook that we cannot see the injustice that is creeping up hourly and daily all around this nation? Nina Simone said one time, they're picking us off one by one. And most of us will scoff at that until you get picked off. Don't ever forget that unless we stand together, we will all suffer the same fate of the others. God bless you. Remember, if they ain't going to pay you, don't work. You got to get paid. If you contracted out, you got to get paid. If you're working by the hour, you got to get paid. Because without the payment, it's going to turn you into a beggar or a thief. Because you have got to have what it takes in order to survive in this culture. Remember, whatever you do, make sure you get paid. All right.